Greetings and welcome back to our study of the parables of Jesus. Parables have been described as earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They are simple stories that are designed to teach a moral or a spiritual lesson. It was one of Jesus' favorite ways of getting his message across. As we've been working on this series, I've come to associate a lot of the stories of Jesus with his teaching style, this parable type of teaching. I was familiar with the stories, but I never really thought of them as parables. The parable that we're going to talk about today, the parable of the Pharisee and the Publican, was one that is put into this category. It's a wonderful and poignant story, but I really never thought much about it as a parable. I really think that it does fall under this umbrella, and we're going to take a look at it. It had a very distinct meaning in the first century, and it fits well into our world today. So let's start by taking a look at the setting. When we read the context for this parable, we see that Jesus' public ministry is going full blast. He's healing lepers, he's blessing babies, he's discussing deep theological concepts. Yet he's also beginning to feel the ominous shadow of the cross. In fact, shortly after telling the story or relating the parable that we're going to talk about here in a minute, Jesus would tell his disciples, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and mistreated and spit upon. And after they have scourged him, they will kill him, and the third day he will rise again." Luke tells us that they really didn't understand what he was saying or what he was talking about, but it helps us develop an understanding of where Jesus is in his life and in his ministry. I think it's interesting that it wasn't going to be the Romans who were going to be the instigators of this travesty. The most convicted people in silencing Jesus were the Jewish religious leaders. They would be led by the Pharisees, and these were folks that were supposed to be very devout people, very religious Jews. They knew the law of Moses. They were dedicated to preserving the law, but their zeal for their religion cost them their sight of one of the most important aspects of it, the coming of the Messiah. This same zeal that would lead them to crucify Jesus led them away from those who needed religion as much as anyone. Not only did they perceive themselves to be more religious than others, frankly, they saw themselves as being better than others. As the apostles stood on the brink of becoming leaders of Christianity, they needed to be reminded of who they were, and as more importantly, of whose they were. They didn't belong just to themselves. They were not going to be the upper echelon of Christians. They needed to understand that as leaders, they needed to be servants or needed to be humble as well. So Jesus tells them a story to get them thinking. Interestingly, it's not just told to the apostles. It appears that some of the self-righteous religious people were there within earshot as well. So let's take a look at the parable by reading the story from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. "And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: 'God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but he was beating his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, the sinner.' I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted." As Jesus begins this story, he has a particular group in mind. It is said that he was talking about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. maybe they didn't see it in themselves. So maybe if he told a story, maybe if he pointed it out in someone else, they would see it. So he tells a story. He tells a story of two men who went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and according to the Pharisee, he was a stand-up guy. He fasted twice a week. He gave back 10% of everything he received. But he also had a problem. He looked down on others. He was very aware of the problems that others had. Some were swindlers, some were unjust, some were adulterers, and some were just common folk. He may not have been in error in what he said about them, but he had a problem in how he saw them. His attitude contradicted his communication with God. He was thanking God for how good he was, as opposed to how good God had been to him. The result, Jesus says that the man was praying to himself. The Pharisee would get what he prayed for. He got the attention of himself. Unfortunately, that was about all that he was going to get out of his prayer. Jesus then compares this to the prayer of a tax collector. This guy would have been considered low class. He was perceived to have sold himself out to the Gentiles. Even if he was a God-fearing believer, he wouldn't have been accepted as one of the religious upper crust, probably no matter how good of a person he was. Yet his prayer was simple and direct. He humbled himself before God and as well as in the sight of other people, and he prayed. His appeal, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Now, I'm sure that all three of the groups that either heard or saw this prayer would have amened it. The Pharisee would have viewed him as a sinner. The tax collector openly stated that he was a sinner. And God knew that the man was a sinner. Yet this man had the ear of God. This man had a relationship and was able to communicate with God. Jesus said the tax collector went away justified by God. His humility and his honesty opened God's ears as well as his heart. Jesus finished the story with a simple but direct message. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. The Lord is going to bless those who are willing to admit their struggles. People can never put on a good enough impression to impress God. But they and we can be humble enough to endear ourselves to him. Now, what's the takeaway from this lesson? What was Jesus trying to say to the people of his day? I think that those who were there, who listened to the original parable, needed a reminder of true religion. The Pharisees and the other factions of Judaism were tempted to see themselves as God's elect among God's people, kind of the best of the best. They saw themselves as the cream of the crop because of what they knew and what they did. Unfortunately, they also saw themselves as the cream of the crop because they felt superior to others. The people who were in the original audience needed to see a couple of things. First, this is bad reasoning. They shouldn't aspire to have this type of attitude. Not only was it wrong, it was also an affront to God. But secondly, it was dangerous reasoning. By thinking that self-righteousness was the way to go, they were apt to alienate themselves from God. And if they weren't careful, they were going to be praying to themselves. Christianity needed to be based on humility as well as unity. Each Christian needed to be able to see the wrong in themselves as well as the right in others. And when they did, everyone would be humbled and everyone would have equal access to God. Now, what does this mean to us today? Folks, I think it's awful tempting to feel religious or even self-righteous in today's world. There is a temptation for religious arrogance. We have been taught that we should alienate ourselves from the evils of the world and even alienate ourselves from those who are teaching false doctrine. And while this is true, we have to make sure that this separation doesn't lead to a perception of superiority. At the end of the day, like everyone else, we are sinners and we need salvation. I think we should feel good about our forgiveness. But we need to remember that we receive our forgiveness at the grace of God, not at the goodness of our lives. A few decades after Jesus taught this parable, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. When we look down on others, we have a tendency to look too highly on ourselves. Religious arrogance opens cracks in our righteousness that can be infiltrated by Satan. When we stay humble and thankful, we stay on a solid spiritual foundation. And when we see others through the eyes of God, we invite them to join in the church that Christ built for all of us. Now, some thought and discussion questions. Number one, is there something that resembles a Pharisaic attitude in modern Christianity? Number two, how should we view those who are not as spiritually mature as us? Number three, list 3 things you do to stay spiritually humble.